As the corpse went past, the flies left the restaurant table in a cloud and rushed after it, but they came back a few minutes later. The crowd of mourners, all men and boys, no women, threaded their way across the marketplace between the piles of pomegranates and the taxis and the camels, wailing a short chant over and over again. What really appeals to the flies is that the corpses here are never put into coffins. They are merely wrapped in a piece of rag and carried on a rough wooden bier on the shoulders of four friends. When the friends get to the burying ground, they hack an oblong hole a foot or two deep, dump the body in it, and fling over it a little of the dried up, lumpy earth, which is like broken brick. No gravestone, no name, no identifying mark of any kind. The burying ground is merely a huge waste of hummocky earth, like a derelict building rock. After a month or two, no one can even be certain where his own relatives are buried. When you walk through a town like this, 200,000 inhabitants, of whom at least 20,000 own literally nothing except the rags they stand up in, when you see how the people live, and still more how easily they die, it is always difficult to believe that you are walking among human beings. All colonial empires are in reality founded upon that fact. The people have brown faces, besides, there are so many of them. Are they really the same flesh as yourself? Do they even have names? Or are they merely a kind of undifferentiated brown stuff, about as individual as bees or coral insects? They rise out from the earth, they sweat and starve for a few years, and then they sink back into the nameless mounds of the graveyard, and nobody notices that they are gone. And even the graves themselves soon fade back into the soil. Sometimes, out for a walk, as you break your way through the prickly pear, you notice that it is rather bumpy underfoot, and only a certain regularity in the bumps tells you that you are walking over skeletons. I was feeding one of the gazelles in the public gardens. Gazelles are almost the only animals that look good to eat when they are still alive. In fact, one can hardly look at their hindquarters without thinking of mint sauce. The gazelle I was feeding seemed to know that this thought was in my mind, for though it took the piece of bread I was holding out, it obviously did not like me. It nibbled rapidly at the bread, then lowered its head and tried to butt me, then took another nibble, and then butted again. Probably its idea was that if it could drive me away, the bread would somehow remain hanging in midair. An Arab navvy working on the path nearby lowered a shiny hoe and sidled towards us. He looked from the gazelle to the bread, and from the bread to the gazelle, with a sort of quiet amazement, as though he had never seen anything quite like this before. Finally, he said shyly in French, "I could eat some of that bread." I tore off a piece, and he stowed it gratefully in some secret place under his rags. This man is an employee of the municipality. All people who work with their hands are partly invisible. They are more, and the more important work they do, the less visible they are. Still, a white skin is always fairly conspicuous. In Northern Europe, when you see a laborer plowing a field, you probably give him a second glance. In a hot country, anywhere south of Gibraltar or east of Suez, the chances are that you don't even see him. I have noticed this again and again. In a tropical landscape, one's eye takes in everything except the human beings. It takes in the dried up soil, the prickly pear, the palm tree, and the distant mountain, but it always misses the peasant hoeing at his patch. He is the same color as the earth, and a great deal less interesting to look at. It is only because of this that the starved countries of Asia and Africa are accepted as tourist resorts. No one would think of running cheap trips through the distressed areas. But where the human beings have brown skins, their poverty is simply not noticed. What does Morocco mean to a Frenchman? An orange grove or a job in the government service? Or to an Englishman, camels, castles, palm trees, foreign legionnaires, brass trays, and bandits? One could probably live here for years without noticing that for 9/10 of the people, the reality of life is an endless, back-breaking struggle to wring little food out of an eroded soil. Most of Morocco is so desolate that no wild animal bigger than a hare can live on it. Huge areas which were once covered with forest have turned into a treeless waste where the soil is exactly like broken up brick. Nevertheless, a good deal of it is cultivated with frightful labor. Everything is done by hand. Long lines of women, bent double like inverted capital L's, work their way slowly across the fields, tearing up the prickly weeds with their hands, and the peasant, gathering lucerne for fodder, pulls it up stalk by stalk instead of reaping it, thus saving an inch or two on each stalk. The plow is a wretched wooden thing, so frail that one can easily carry it on one's shoulder, and fitted underneath with a rough iron spike which stirs the soil to a depth of about 4 inches. This is as much as the strength of the animals is equal to. It is usual to plow with a cow and a donkey yoked together. Two donkeys would not be quite strong enough, but on the other hand, two cows would cost a little more to feed. The peasants possess no harrows. They merely plow the soil several times over in different directions, finally leaving it in rough furrows, after which the whole field has to be shaped with hoes into small oblong patches to conserve water. Except for a day or two after the rare rainstorms, there is never enough water. Along the edges of the fields, channels are hacked out to a depth of 30 or 40 feet to get at the tiny trickles which run through the subsoil. Every afternoon, a file of very old women passes down the road outside my house, each carrying a load of firewood. All of them are mummified with age and the sun, and all of them are tiny. It seems to be generally the case in primitive communities that the women, when they get beyond a certain age, shrink to the size of children. One day, a poor old creature who could have not been more than 4 feet tall crept past me under a vast load of wood. I stopped her and put a 5-sou piece into her hand. She answered with a shrill wail, almost a scream, which was partly gratitude, but mainly surprise. I suppose that from her point of view, by taking any notice of her, I seemed almost to be violating the law of nature. She accepted her status as an old woman, that is to say, as a beast of burden. When a family is traveling, it is quite usual to see a father and a grown-up son riding ahead on donkeys, and an old woman following on foot, carrying the baggage. But what is strange about these people is their invisibility. For several weeks, always about the same time of day, the file of old women had hobbled past the house with their firewood, and though they had registered themselves in my eyeballs, I cannot truly say that I had seen them. Firewood was passing. That's how I saw it. It was only that one day that I happened to be walking behind them, and the curious up and down motion of a load of wood drew my attention to the human being underneath it. Then, for the first time, I noticed the poor, old earth-colored bodies reduced to bones and leathery skin, bent double under the crushing weight. Yet I suppose I had not been 5 minutes on Moroccan soil before I noticed the overloading of the donkeys and was infuriated by it. There is no question that the donkeys are damnably treated. The Moroccan donkey is hardly bigger than a St. Bernard dog. It carries a load which in the British Army would be considered too much for a 15-hands mule. And very often its pack saddle is not taken off its back for weeks together. But what is peculiarly pitiful is that it is the most willing creature on earth. It follows its master like a dog and does not need either bridle or halter. After a dozen years of devoted work, it suddenly drops dead, whereupon its master tips it into the ditch, and the village dogs have torn its guts out before it is cold. This kind of thing makes one's blood boil, whereas, on the whole, the plight of the human beings does not. I am not commenting, merely pointing to a fact. People with brown skins are next to invisible. Anyone can be sorry for the donkey with its galled back, but it is generally owing to some kind of accident if one even notices the old woman under her load of sticks. As the storks flew northward, the Negroes were marching southward. A long, dusty column, infantry, screwed batteries, and then more infantry. 4,000 or 5,000 men in all, winding up the road with a clumping of boots and a clatter of iron wheels. They were Senegalese, the blackest Negroes in Africa, so black that sometimes it is difficult to see whereabouts on their necks and the hair begins. Their splendid bodies were hidden in reach-me-down khaki uniforms, their feet squashed into boots that looked like blocks of wood, and every tin hat seemed to be a couple sizes too small. It was very hot, and the men had marched a long way. They slumped under the weight of their packs, and the curiously sensitive black faces were glistening with sweat. As they went past, a tall, young Negro turned and caught my eye. But the look he gave me was not in the least kind of the look you might expect. Not hostile, not contemptuous, not sullen, not even inquisitive. It was the shy, wide-eyed Negro look, which is actually a look of profound respect. I saw how it was. This wretched boy, who is a French citizen and has therefore been dragged from the forest to scrub floors and catch syphilis in garrison towns, actually has feelings of reverence before a white skin. He has been taught that the white race are his masters, and he still believes it. But there is one thought that every man thinks when he sees a black army marching past. How much longer are we going to kid these people? How long before they turn their guns in the other direction? It was curious, really. Every white man there has his thoughts stowed somewhere or other in his mind. I had it. So had the other onlookers. So had the officers in their sweating chargers and the white NCOs marching in the ranks. It was a kind of secret which we all knew, and were all too clever to tell. Only the Negroes didn't know it. And really, it was almost like watching a flock of cattle to see the long column, a mile or 2 miles long, of armed men flowing peacefully up the road, while the great white birds drifted over them in the opposite direction, glittering like scraps of paper.